Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The strategic arrogance of the Nazi high command, personified most vividly in the figure of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, serves as one of the most significant cautionary tales in the history of industrial warfare. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Göring, a decorated World War I fighter ace and the head of the Luftwaffe, viewed the industrial potential of the United States with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. His worldview was anchored in the localized successes of the German Blitzkrieg, a military doctrine that relied on high-quality, specialized machinery and short, sharp campaigns. To Göring, the idea of an overseas power, particularly one that he perceived as being culturally soft and dominated by civilian commercial interests, producing tens of thousands of advanced combat aircraft, was not merely improbable, it was a physical and economic impossibility. This dismissive attitude was most famously encapsulated in his reaction to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1940 call for the United States to produce 50,000 airplanes a year. Göring reportedly laughed at the figure, viewing it as a piece of propagandistic theater designed to intimidate the Axis without any basis in industrial reality. However, the subsequent 4 years would witness a transformation of the American economy into the arsenal of democracy that would not only meet Roosevelt's impossible target but exceed it, reaching a peak production of nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. This massive output would systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe, starve the German war machine of its air cover, and ultimately prove that in the age of total war, the assembly line was a more powerful weapon than the most elite fighter wing. To understand the depth of Göring's miscalculation, one must examine the state of German aviation in the period leading up to the invasion of Poland. The Luftwaffe had been rebuilt in secret and then in the open, utilizing the finest engineering minds of the Reich. Machines like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Junkers Ju 87 Stuka were marvels of aerodynamic efficiency and specialized design. They were built using a craftsman approach, high precision, manual assembly by skilled workers, and constant, minor modifications. This system worked well for producing hundreds or even a few thousand high-performance planes for a quick war in Europe. Göring believed that this qualitative edge, combined with the combat experience gained in the Spanish Civil War, made the Luftwaffe invincible. He viewed the United States as a nation of carmakers who lacked the spirit and the specialized technical discipline required to build complex flying machines. When Roosevelt made his 50,000 plane announcement in May 1940, the United States was producing fewer than 3,000 planes a year. To Göring, the gap between 3,000 and 50,000 was so vast that it could only be bridged by lies. He famously remarked that the Americans were good at making refrigerators and razors but that they would never be able to master the intricacies of combat aviation on a grand scale. The American response to this skepticism was a total mobilization of its industrial base that remains unparalleled. The key to the American miracle was the application of Fordist, mass production techniques to the aeronautical industry. Leading this charge were the titans of the automotive industry, most notably the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Chrysler. These companies understood a fundamental truth that Göring missed. A complex machine like an airplane could be broken down into standardized components that could be manufactured by semi-skilled workers on a moving assembly line. The most iconic symbol of this transition was the Willow Run plant in Michigan. Built by Henry Ford specifically to produce the B-24 Liberator bomber, Willow Run was at the time the largest factory in the world under one roof. It utilized a mile-long assembly line where, at its peak, a 4-engine bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. This was a pace of production that the German aircraft industry, with its reliance on dispersed manufacturing and skilled hand finishing, could not even begin to comprehend. While Göring was boasting of the Luftwaffe's quality, the United States was redefining quality as a byproduct of a perfected, repeatable industrial process. The disparity in output began to manifest on the battlefield as early as 1942, but by 1944, it had become an overwhelming flood of steel and aluminum. In 1944, the United States produced exactly 96,318 aircraft. To put this in perspective, this single year of American production nearly equaled the entire wartime production of the German aviation industry from 1939 to 1945. This was not just a matter of more planes, it was a matter of better planes delivered in impossible quantities. The American industry produced the long-range P-51 Mustang, the rugged B-17 Flying Fortress, and the technologically advanced B-29 Superfortress. Each of these machines was produced with a level of standardization that allowed for rapid field repairs using interchangeable parts, a logistical luxury the Germans rarely enjoyed. Göring's laughter turned to silence as the refrigerators and razors he had mocked began to appear over the skies of Germany in formations of 1,000 bombers at a time, protected by hundreds of long-range escort fighters. The failure of the German aviation strategy was also rooted in its lack of long-term vision. Göring and the Luftwaffe leadership had failed to develop a heavy, four-engine strategic bomber, focusing instead on medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and the Dornier Do-17, which were effective in support of ground troops but lacked the range and payload to strike the industrial heart of an opponent. Furthermore, the German production system was plagued by constant interference from the political leadership. Modifications were often ordered mid-production, leading to a proliferation of sub-variants that made maintenance a nightmare. In contrast, the United States focused on a few core designs and refined the production process to maximize throughput. The American War Production Board coordinated with private industry to ensure that raw materials like aluminum and high-octane fuel were prioritized for the air effort. The result was a virtuous cycle of production where increased volume led to lower costs and higher reliability. The human element of the American production miracle was equally important. As millions of men were drafted into the military, the American workforce was augmented by millions of women, the Rosie the Riveters, who took their places on the assembly lines. This social mobilization was something Göring's ideological framework did not anticipate. In the Nazi worldview, women were to be confined to Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. While Germany eventually tried to use slave labor from the concentration camps to sustain its production, this was a poor substitute for the motivated, patriotic, and increasingly skilled American civilian workforce. The American factory worker was a direct participant in the air war, knowing that the plane they helped build today would be in combat within weeks. This connection between the home front and the front line gave the American effort a momentum that the coerced labor of the Reich could never replicate. As the war progressed, Göring's personal decline mirrored the decline of the Luftwaffe. His prestige, built on the early successes in Poland and France, was shattered by the failure of the Battle of Britain and the inability of the Luftwaffe to protect the German people from the Allied strategic bombing campaign. His famous promise that no enemy bomber will reach the Ruhr became a bitter joke among the German population, who began to refer to him as Meyer, a name he had promised to take if a single bomb fell on Germany. By 1944, Göring was largely a marginalized figure, retreating into a world of drug addiction and art looting, while the 100,000 planes he had laughed at were methodically reducing the Third Reich to ashes. The industrial might of America had not just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had invalidated the entire tactical philosophy upon which the German military was built. The historical analysis of the 1940 to 1944 period shows that the arsenal of democracy was not a spontaneous event but the result of a deliberate, coordinated effort to leverage the existing strengths of the American economy. Men like William Knudsen of General Motors and Donald Nelson of the War Production Board acted as the architects of this transition. They understood that the United States had a unique advantage in its culture of the machine. The average American was comfortable with technology, whether it was a tractor on a farm or a car in a city. This baseline of technical literacy allowed for the rapid training of millions of people to perform complex industrial tasks. In Germany, the emphasis was on the expert, while in America, the emphasis was on the system. The American system proved to be more resilient, more scalable, and ultimately more lethal. The technological leap that occurred during this time was also significant. The development of the jet engine, radar, and advanced navigational systems was accelerated by the massive funding and industrial capacity of the Allied effort. While Germany produced the first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, it was too little, too late. The American industry was already producing thousands of high-performance piston engine fighters that could overwhelm the Me-262 through sheer numbers and superior tactical coordination. The 100,000 planes were not just machines, they were platforms for a suite of technologies that the Germans could not match in quantity. The American ability to mass-produce precision-engineered items like the Norden bombsight or the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine meant that every Allied pilot went into battle with a technological edge that was supported by an infinite supply chain. The legacy of the American aircraft production miracle continues to define the modern world. It established the United States as the global leader in aerospace technology and set the standard for the military-industrial complex. It proved that in the modern era, national security is inextricably linked to industrial capacity and the ability to innovate at scale. Hermann Göring's laughter in 1940 was the sound of a past era, one of aristocrats and knights of the air, confronting the cold, hard reality of the 20th century industrial state. The 100,000 planes were the definitive answer to his skepticism, a physical manifestation of a nation's resolve and its ability to turn the impossible into a daily production quota. The depth of Göring's delusion was further evidenced by his refusal to believe intelligence reports about American aircraft production as late as 1943. When presented with figures showing the massive increase in U.S. output, he would often dismiss them as Jewish Bolshevik lies or exaggerated claims designed to demoralize the German people. He was a prisoner of his own propaganda, unable to accept that the decadent West could out-organize the Reich. This cognitive dissonance led to a series of strategic errors, such as the failure to prioritize pilot training or the development of long-range air defenses, until the Allied air superiority was absolute. By the time the German leadership realized the true scale of the American threat, the factories of Detroit and California had already won the war. The structural differences between the US and German economies also played a role. The German economy was a command economy, but it was also a feudal one, with different Nazi leaders, Göring, Speer, Himmler, Goebbels, competing for resources and influence. This led to inefficiency and a lack of a unified industrial strategy. In contrast, the U.S. military-industrial effort was a partnership between the government and private enterprise. While there was regulation and oversight, the inherent efficiency and innovation of the American capitalist system were harnessed for the war effort. The profit motive, combined with patriotic duty, created a level of competition and problem-solving that the German state-controlled industry could not match. For example, the rivalry between companies like Douglas, Lockheed, and Boeing led to rapid improvements in aircraft design and manufacturing efficiency. Furthermore, the American focus on logistics as a weapon was a direct result of its industrial capacity. The U.S. Air Transport Command and the Ferrying Command ensured that a plane built in Wichita or Seattle could be delivered to a front line in North Africa or the Pacific in a matter of days. This global reach was supported by a massive infrastructure of airbases, fuel pipelines, and maintenance depots, all of which were built with the same mass production mentality as the planes themselves. Göring's Luftwaffe, by contrast, struggled to move supplies and aircraft between the eastern and western fronts, often finding itself paralyzed by a lack of transport or fuel. The 100,000 planes were the visible tip of an iceberg of logistical power that the German leadership had completely failed to anticipate. The final irony of Göring's laughter is that the very techniques he mocked were what made the liberation of Europe possible. Without the overwhelming air superiority provided by American production, the D-Day landings would have been an impossibility. The Allied air forces systematically destroyed the German rail and road networks, neutralized the Luftwaffe on the ground, and provided constant close air support for the advancing infantry. The Texas farmer, who destroyed 258 tanks, the medics who turned survival rates upside down, and the snipers in the ruins were all protected by a canopy of American-made steel. The 100,000 planes were the ultimate shield and sword of the Allied cause, proving that the most important territory in modern war is not the land, but the industrial and technological space above it. In the aftermath of the war, at the Nuremberg trials, Göring was forced to confront the reality of the American miracle. When questioned about the failure of the Luftwaffe, he admitted that the American production capacity was the single most decisive factor in the German defeat. He spoke of the terror of seeing the American bomber streams and the realization that for every plane the Germans shot down, the Americans could produce 10 more. His laughter had long since turned to a bitter acknowledgement of his own strategic failure. He had underestimated the American spirit, but more importantly, he had underestimated the American machine. The 100,000 planes also had a profound impact on the post-war civilian world. The mass production of aluminum, the advancements in jet propulsion, and the development of radar and synthetic materials all became the foundation of the post-war economic boom. The factories that had built the B-24s and P-51s were repurposed to build the airliners and cars of the 1950s and 60s. The arsenal of democracy had not only won the war but had created the blueprint for the modern consumer society. This was the final, lasting victory of the American industrial system over the New Order. The very refrigerators and razors that Göring had mocked became the symbols of a global prosperity that the Nazi ideology could never offer. The story of Roosevelt's 50,000 planes and the 100,000 that were actually built serves as a permanent reminder of the power of a clear goal and the mobilization of a free people. It shows that when a society's industrial, scientific, and human resources are aligned, there is no limit to what can be achieved. Göring's mistake was not just an intellectual one, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the modern world. He believed that war was a test of will and heritage, while the Americans proved that it was a test of data and production. The 100,000 planes were the data, and the production was the proof. The technological sophistication of the American aircraft was also a factor in the overwhelming nature of the defeat. The US didn't just build many planes, they built highly specialized ones. The development of the turbo supercharger by General Electric allowed American bombers to fly at altitudes where most German flak and fighters were less effective. The invention of the G-suit for fighter pilots allowed them to perform high-speed maneuvers that would have knocked out a German pilot. The mass production of self-sealing fuel tanks and heavy armor plating for crews increased the survivability of Allied aircraft, ensuring that veteran pilots returned to train new ones. Every one of these advancements was integrated into the production line with a speed that the German bureaucracy could not match. Göring's laughter was a symptom of a rigid system that could not adapt to the fluid, high-speed innovation of its opponent. The American ability to standardize aircraft engines was particularly impressive. The Allison V1710 and the various models of Pratt & Whitney and Wright engines were produced by the hundreds of thousands. These engines were then utilized across multiple aircraft types, simplifying the logistics of spare parts and maintenance. In contrast, the German industry produced a bewildering array of engine types and subtypes, often unique to a specific aircraft manufacturer. This bespoke approach to engineering was the pride of the German craftsman but the downfall of the German soldier. When an American engine failed, it could be replaced with an identical unit from a crate. When a German engine failed, it often required a team of specialists to fit a replacement. The 100,000 planes were supported by 1,000,000 identical hearts, a triumph of the standardized machine over the individual work of art. Furthermore, the US developed a production feedback loop that was superior to any other in the war. Combat reports from pilots in the Pacific or Europe were sent directly back to the engineers at North American Aviation, Grumman, or Republic. Modifications based on these reports were often implemented on the production line within weeks. This meant that the American planes were constantly evolving in response to the enemy's tactics. Göring's Luftwaffe, by contrast, was often stuck with designs that were years out of date, because the cost of changing the production line was seen as too high. The American 100,000 planes were not a static fleet, they were a living, evolving technological force that grew more lethal with every day of the war. The financial mobilization behind this effort was also a marvel of democratic government. The American people funded the 100,000 planes through war bonds and increased taxes, a voluntary investment in the nation's future that contrasted sharply with the forced donations and plunder that sustained the Reich. The transparency and legitimacy of the American system allowed for the sustainable expenditure of billions of dollars on aviation. The refrigerators and razors were the foundation of a wealth that was then converted into the most powerful air force in history. Göring, who lived in a palace surrounded by stolen art, could not understand a power that was built on the collective economic strength of a free middle class. The final phase of the air war saw the American industry produce the B-29 Superfortress, a machine so complex and expensive that its development cost more than the Manhattan Project. The B-29 featured a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a computer-controlled firing system. It was the ultimate expression of the American industrial and technological miracle. When the B-29s began to devastate the Japanese home islands, they were doing so with a technology that was a decade ahead of anything the Axis possessed. The 100,000 planes had reached their peak of sophistication, proving that the American mass production model was capable of producing the most advanced and the most numerous weapons simultaneously. The historical record of 1940 to 1945 remains a testament to the power of the arsenal of democracy. It is a story of how a peaceful, civilian-oriented nation can transform itself into an unstoppable military force through the application of science, industry, and the collective will of its people. Hermann Göring's laughter at Roosevelt's plan remains the definitive symbol of the arrogance of the old world, in the face of the efficiency of the new. The 100,000 planes were the definitive answer to the 20th century's greatest ideological and military threat, a victory of the assembly line that ensured the survival of freedom in the air and on the ground. The shadow of those 100,000 planes still falls across the history of the modern world, a reminder that the true strength of a nation lies in its ability to produce, to innovate, and to believe in the impossible. The American production miracle was not without its own internal challenges. There were shortages of critical materials, labor disputes, and the constant friction of a massive bureaucracy. However, the American system was designed to handle such friction. The Truman Committee in the Senate investigated waste and corruption in the defense industry, ensuring that the billions of dollars being spent were used effectively. This level of self-correction and accountability was completely absent in the Nazi system, where dissent was treason and failure was often hidden. The 100,000 planes were the product of a system that was honest with itself about its own weaknesses and aggressive in its pursuit of its strengths. As we look back on the Texas farmer, the ruins of the East, and the medics in the field, we must recognize that they were the beneficiaries of a grand industrial strategy that prioritized air power. The U.S. realized early on that the most efficient way to destroy an enemy's capacity to fight was to seize the sky. The 100,000 planes were the realization of that strategy. They turned the English Channel into an Allied lake, the Mediterranean into an Allied sea, and the Pacific into an Allied ocean. They were the bridge to the final victory, built with the rivets of Detroit and the engines of Hartford. Göring's laughter was the last sound of an old world dying, and the roar of the 100,000 planes was the first sound of a new world being born. The industrial legacy of this period is still with us. Many of the companies that led the way in 1944 are still the leaders in aerospace and high technology today. The culture of innovation and scale that was perfected in the 1940s remains the primary driver of the global economy. The miracle was not a one-time event, it was the birth of a new way of living and working. The 100,000 planes were the first great achievement of the modern world, a monument to what can be accomplished when a free people decides that there is no goal too high and no target too large. Hermann Göring was right about one thing: the Americans were good at making refrigerators and razors. But he was fatally wrong about what happened when those same people decided to make war. In the final year of the war, the U.S. output was so high that they actually began to slow down production of certain types of aircraft because they simply had no more pilots to fly them or space to park them. The problem was no longer how to produce enough, but how to manage the staggering surplus. This was a level of success that no other nation in history has ever matched. The 100,000 planes were the physical proof that the United States had become the first truly global superpower, a nation that could project its will into every corner of the earth through the sheer weight of its industrial output. The laughter of the Reichsmarschall was a small sound in the face of such a monumental reality, a final, pathetic echo of a failed ideology that was literally buried under the weight of the American machine. The details of specific production successes are worth noting to illustrate the scale. The North American aviation plant in Inglewood, California, and its sister plants in Dallas and Kansas City, produced over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. The Douglas Aircraft Company produced over 10,000 C-47s, the workhorse of the Allied logistics. Grumman on Long Island produced the Iron Works series of fighters, the Wildcat and the Hellcat, that broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Each of these figures is a small war in itself, a victory of planning, labor, and execution. The 100,000 planes were not just a statistic. They were 100,000 individual acts of triumph over the skepticism of the enemy and the limitations of the past. The story of the 100,000 planes is the story of the 20th century. It is the story of how the power shifted from the battlefield to the laboratory and the factory. It is the story of how the individual hero was replaced by the collective effort of millions. And most of all, it is the story of how a nation's ability to imagine a better future, and to build it with its own hands, is the ultimate source of its strength. Hermann Göring's laughter was the sound of a man who couldn't imagine such a future. The 100,000 planes were the sound of a people who could. The environmental and economic impact of this production on the American landscape was profound. Entire cities grew up around aircraft plants. The population of the West Coast exploded as workers flocked to the shipyards and the aviation factories. This internal migration changed the political and social map of the United States forever. The 100,000 planes were the catalyst for the modern American middle class, providing high-paying industrial jobs and the opportunity for education and advancement. The war effort was a massive public investment in the American people, and the dividends are still being paid today. This social byproduct of the industrial miracle was something the Nazi leadership, with their focus on conquest and destruction, could never have achieved. In the end, the art of deception, the survival rates, the snipers, and the ammunition crisis were all interconnected parts of a single, grand Allied narrative. But that narrative was only possible because the 100,000 planes had secured the heavens. The air superiority provided by American production allowed the deceivers to work in secret, the medics to fly the wounded to safety, the snipers to hold their ground, and the ammunition to reach the front. The planes were the infrastructure of victory. They were the liquid gold of the sky, just as the gasoline was the liquid gold of the ground. And both were produced by the same unstoppable American engine that Hermann Göring had once laughed at. The final image of the war in the air is one of absolute dominance. By May 1945, Allied planes were flying over Germany with almost no opposition. They were no longer just attacking military targets, they were providing air cover for the final liberation of the continent. The 100,000 planes had achieved their purpose. They had broken the new order and paved the way for a new era of peace and prosperity. The laughter of 1940 was a distant memory, replaced by the roar of 1,000 engines that signaled the end of the long night. The American machine had won, and in doing so, it had changed the world forever. The historical reality of the American aircraft production miracle is a testament to the fact that industrial power is the ultimate arbiter of modern conflict. It showed that a nation's strength is not just in its soldiers, but in its ability to produce the tools of their success. Hermann Göring's failure to recognize this was his greatest strategic error, and it cost him his air force, his country, and ultimately his life. The 100,000 planes were the physical manifestation of a nation's resolve and its ability to outthink and outproduce its enemies. Their story remains one of the most compelling and important chapters in the history of the 20th century, a permanent reminder that in the age of total war, the assembly line is the most lethal weapon of all. As we conclude this analysis, it is essential to remember that the 100,000 planes were not just numbers on a page. They were 100,000 stories of engineering, labor, and courage. They were the rivets in the wings, the oil in the engines, and the pilots in the cockpits. They were the physical embodiment of the American spirit, a spirit that refused to be intimidated by the laughter of a dictator. They were the arsenal of democracy in flight, and their victory was the victory of a free and industrial people. The shadow of those planes still falls across the history of the modern world, a reminder of what is possible when a nation decides that its future is worth building, one plane at a time.